My husband's dying wish was to see his mother one last time. She never even responded. For years she tried to break us apart. She wanted him to marry someone else, and when he chose me, she cut him off completely. Even when he was dying, she refused to see him. And when he passed, she showed up at the funeral screaming. Not to grieve, not to say goodbye, but to demand his estate. She called me a thief, a liar. And that's when I realized she didn't lose a son. She threw him away. The first time I met Mark, I felt like my world had clicked into place. It was during our final year of college. Both of us were engineering students drawn to problem solving and innovation. We bonded over late-night project discussions, shared laughter during study breaks, and a shared dream of building a meaningful life. It didn't take long for our connection to deepen, and before we knew it, we were inseparable. After graduation, we moved to the city together. We found good jobs, rented a cozy apartment, and started shaping the future we envisioned. It felt like everything was falling into place. We were young, ambitious, and deeply in love. The world seemed full of possibilities. But there was one shadow over our happiness: Mark's mother, Evelyn. From the moment I met her, it was clear that Evelyn had her own plans for Mark's life, and I wasn't a part of them. She had always envisioned Mark marrying Sarah, the daughter of her close friend. Sarah was everything Evelyn wanted in a daughter-in-law: quiet, obedient, and someone who would let Evelyn remain the central figure in Mark's life. I, on the other hand, was independent, outspoken, and driven by my own career ambitions. Evelyn didn't like me from the start, and she made no effort to hide it. In the beginning, I tried my best to win her over. I went out of my way to be polite and considerate. I joined Mark on visits to her house, helped out in the kitchen during family dinners, and even listened patiently as she spoke about Sarah as though she were the greatest person on earth. But no matter what I did, Evelyn's disdain for me was palpable. It started subtly, with little digs and backhanded compliments. She would comment on my career choices, questioning whether I could balance work and a relationship. She'd compare me to Sarah, pointing out how Sarah had more traditional values and was a better fit for Mark. But as time went on, her disapproval became more overt. Evelyn began orchestrating these family dinners that always seemed to include Sarah and her mother. She pretended it was a coincidence, but it was painfully obvious what she was doing. At these dinners, Evelyn would ignore me entirely, instead lavishing Sarah with praise for her accomplishments and talking about how well she and Mark got along. It was as though she were staging auditions for the role of Mark's wife, and I wasn't even considered a contender. Mark, to his credit, saw through his mother's manipulations. He always tried to include me in the conversation, defending me when Evelyn's comments became too pointed. But it was clear that Evelyn wasn't going to accept me no matter what I did. It was exhausting. Each dinner left me feeling more isolated, and I began to dread every visit to Evelyn's house. Things came to a head when Mark and I got engaged. We were ecstatic, hopeful that our commitment to each other might soften Evelyn's stance. When we announced the engagement to her, we genuinely believed she might come around. But instead of congratulations, Evelyn reacted with fury. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed at Mark, tears streaming down her face. "You're throwing your life away for her." She refused to acknowledge the ring on my finger and stormed out of the room. Not long after, she went no contact with Mark. She told him that if he married me, he would no longer be her son. Mark was devastated, but he stood by me. He loved his mother, but he wasn't willing to sacrifice our relationship to appease her. It was a painful decision, but one that only deepened our bond. In the months leading up to our wedding, Evelyn ramped up her efforts to undermine us. She would leave Mark voicemails, begging him to reconsider and marry Sarah instead. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she would say. "You'll regret this, Mark." Her words weighed heavily on him, but he never wavered in his support for me. Our wedding day was beautiful, filled with love and happiness. But there was a lingering sadness in the air. Evelyn wasn't there. Despite everything, Mark had held out hope that she might show up, that she might set aside her pride for one day to support him. But she didn't. She stayed true to her word, cutting him out of her life entirely. The years that followed were a mix of joy and sorrow. Mark and I built a wonderful life together. His career flourished and I advanced in mine. We bought a lovely home and welcomed two beautiful children, a boy and a girl. Our days were filled with laughter, love, and the kind of happiness we had dreamed of back in college. But Evelyn's absence was a constant shadow. She never acknowledged our marriage, our home, or our children. She refused to meet her grandchildren, clinging to her bitterness and resentment. For 5 years she remained a ghost in our lives, and while we tried to move forward, I knew the estrangement weighed heavily on Mark. "She's my mother," he would say quietly when the topic came up. "I just wish she could accept us." It broke my heart to see how much her rejection hurt him. Despite everything she had done, he still loved her. He still longed for her approval. But as the years passed, it became clear that Evelyn wasn't going to change. Little did we know the biggest challenge of our lives was yet to come. A few months ago, Mark was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. The prognosis was grim, and his condition deteriorated rapidly. Watching the man I loved fade away was the most painful experience of my life. But even in his final days, Mark held on to hope that he could reconcile with his mother. He reached out to her one last time, writing her a heartfelt letter. He told her about his diagnosis, about our children, and about how much he missed her. He begged her to come see him, to let go of the past and be part of our family. But Evelyn never responded. Mark passed away with a broken heart, knowing his mother would never accept our family. And as I stood by his bedside, holding his hand as he took his last breath, I promised him I would protect the life we had built together, the life Evelyn had refused to be a part of. Mark's funeral was the hardest day of my life. The man who had been my best friend, my partner, my everything was gone. I had spent weeks preparing myself for this moment, but nothing could have eased the crushing weight of grief that came with saying goodbye. The service was small and intimate, filled with close friends, family, and colleagues who loved Mark deeply. I made a deliberate choice not to inform Evelyn about the funeral. After years of her disdain and rejection, I didn't want her there, turning an already devastating day into a scene of drama. But my plans didn't matter. Evelyn showed up anyway. I didn't even see her at first. I was focused on keeping it together for our children, who were both struggling to process the loss of their father. Then out of nowhere I heard her voice. Sharp, venomous, unmistakable. I turned to see her standing near the entrance, her face a mixture of anger and grief. "How dare you?" she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "How dare you hold a funeral for my son and not invite me?" The room fell silent. All eyes were on us. I could feel the weight of everyone's stares, their shock at the scene unfolding before them. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "Evelyn," I said calmly, "this isn't the time or place for this." But she wasn't interested in keeping the peace. "You stole my son from me," she screamed, her voice echoing through the room. "You're the reason he's dead. And now you're trying to erase me from his life entirely." Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see how much they hurt. "This is a day to honor Mark's memory," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Please don't do this." Instead of calming down, Evelyn's outburst escalated. She began shouting accusations, claiming that I had poisoned Mark and driven him to his death. She turned to the guests, painting herself as the grieving mother who had been cruelly excluded from her own son's life. It was a spectacle, and I could feel the mood in the room shift as people exchanged uneasy glances. I tried to de-escalate the situation, telling Evelyn that we could talk privately after the service. But she refused to listen. "I want answers now," she demanded. "And I want to know what's happening with Mark's estate. As his mother, I have a right to know what he left behind." Her demand stunned me. This wasn't just grief or anger, this was about money and control. Fortunately, Mark had anticipated something like this. In the weeks before his passing, he had taken steps to ensure that his wishes would be honored. He updated his will, leaving everything to me and our children. He also wrote a letter to his mother, explaining his decision and the reasons behind it. I reached into my bag and handed Evelyn the envelope containing the documents. She snatched it from my hands and tore it open, scanning the pages with frantic urgency. As she read through the details, her expression shifted from anger to disbelief, and finally to devastation. Mark's letter was clear and direct. He expressed his heartbreak over their estrangement and his disappointment in her refusal to accept our family. He told her that he had always hoped for reconciliation, But her actions had left him no choice but to exclude her from his will. "I wanted you to be a part of my life," he wrote. "But you made it impossible. My priority is my wife and children. And I hope you can find peace in knowing that I lived a happy life despite everything." For a brief moment I saw a flicker of something in Evelyn's eyes, regret perhaps or sadness. But it was fleeting. She crumpled the letter in her hands and turned back to me, her voice rising once again. "This is your doing," she shouted. "You turned him against me. You poisoned him against his own mother." I clenched my fists, struggling to hold back tears. I wanted to scream, to tell her how much pain she had caused Mark, how her refusal to accept our family had broken his heart. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Evelyn was too consumed by her own bitterness to see the truth. The funeral service, which should have been a moment of solace and reflection, was overshadowed by Evelyn's outburst. She stormed out eventually, but not before ensuring that everyone in attendance had heard her accusations. I could feel the judgment in the room as guests whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between me and the door where Evelyn had exited. After the service, a few people approached me, offering words of comfort. But even their kindness felt tainted by the spectacle Evelyn had created. I couldn't shake the feeling that her accusations would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed the scene. As if losing Mark wasn't painful enough, I now had to contend with the fallout of Evelyn's manipulations. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn's behavior became even more unhinged. She began spreading lies about me to anyone who would listen. She told Mark's extended family and mutual friends that I had forged the documents, that I had manipulated Mark into cutting her out of his will, and most horrifyingly, that I had poisoned him to secure his assets. Her accusations were baseless and cruel, but they were effective. People I once considered friends began to distance themselves, their messages of support replaced with cold indifference. At first, I tried to ignore the rumors, hoping they would die down on their own. But Evelyn was relentless. She posted her lies on social media, sent emails to Mark's colleagues, and even confronted people in public, painting herself as the victim of my supposed betrayal. The more she spread her narrative, the more isolated I felt. The final straw came when Evelyn showed up at my house unannounced. She banged on the door, yelling loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You're a thief and a liar," she screamed. "I'll take you to court if I have to. You won't get away with this." I didn't answer the door. I sat on the floor with my back against it, clutching my knees to my chest as her shouts echoed through the hallway. My children were upstairs, thankfully unaware of the chaos unfolding below. I knew I couldn't let this continue, not for their sake and not for mine. After Evelyn finally left, I called the police to report the incident. They advised me to document everything and consider filing a restraining order. That night I sat down and wrote out every interaction I had with Evelyn since Mark's passing, compiling text messages, emails, and photos of the damage she had caused. It was exhausting and emotionally draining, but I knew it was necessary. Evelyn wasn't going to stop on her own, and it was time to take action. As I sat in my living room that night, surrounded by piles of evidence and legal documents, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. Evelyn had tried to tear my family apart, even after Mark's death. But I wasn't going to let her win. For the sake of my children and the memory of the man I loved, I was ready to fight back. The days after Mark's funeral were some of the darkest in my life. Losing him felt like losing the ground beneath my feet, and I was doing my best to stay strong for our children. But Evelyn wasn't about to let me grieve in peace. Her behavior only escalated, and soon, her lies and accusations began to ripple through every corner of my life. It started with whispers. Friends, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances began pulling away from me. Evelyn had gone to anyone who would listen, telling them that I had manipulated Mark into cutting her out of his life and his will. But her lies didn't stop there. She claimed I had poisoned him, that I had deliberately isolated him from his family while he was sick, and that I had forged the legal documents that left his estate to me and our children. First, I tried to ignore it. I thought surely the people who truly knew me would see through her stories. But Evelyn's narrative was relentless. She was smart, weaving just enough truth into her lies to make them seem believable. She told people how Mark had reached out to her before his death, pleading for reconciliation, a fact that was true, but she twisted it to make it seem like I had been the one to stop him from reconnecting with her. She painted herself as the grieving, wronged mother who had been cruelly shut out by an evil daughter-in-law. I started receiving accusatory messages from mutual friends, colleagues of Mark, and even some members of his extended family. They called me selfish, manipulative, and heartless. People I thought would support me suddenly turned against me, convinced by Evelyn's lies. Every text, every cold glance at the grocery store, felt like another blow. I had already lost Mark, and now I was losing the community I thought I could lean on. But Evelyn didn't stop at spreading rumors. She started showing up at my house. The first time it was during the middle of the day. I was in the backyard with my children when I heard loud banging on the front door. My stomach dropped as soon as I saw her through the peephole. She was furious, yelling loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You can't hide forever," she screamed. "That money is mine, and I'm not going to let you steal it from me." I didn't answer the door. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. But she kept banging and yelling for nearly 20 minutes before finally leaving. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying her words in my mind, wondering how far she was willing to go. Would she come back? Would she try to force her way in? Over the next few weeks, Evelyn showed up several more times, each visit more aggressive than the last. Sometimes she'd bring other people with her, friends or relatives who had bought into her lies. They'd stand on my porch, yelling accusations and demanding that I hand over Mark's estate. I called the police more than once, but their visits didn't seem to deter her. She was relentless. My breaking point came one afternoon when Evelyn showed up while my kids were home from school. I had just picked them up and was helping my daughter with her homework when the banging on the door started again. My son ran to the window to see who it was, and when he saw Evelyn, his face fell. "Why is Grandma here?" he asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer him. How could I explain that their grandmother, who they barely knew, was trying to tear our family apart? I told him to go upstairs and play while I dealt with it, but I could see the fear and confusion in his eyes. It broke my heart. As Evelyn's shouting grew louder, I realized I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't let her disrupt our lives any longer. I called my lawyer, a friend of mine who had been helping me sort through Mark's estate, and told her everything. The rumors, the harassment, the unannounced visits. She listened carefully and then said the words I had been dreading. "You need to file a restraining order." Filing the restraining order was both empowering and terrifying. I had to recount every instance of Evelyn's harassment, from the lies she spread about me to the time she had shown up at my house. I gathered evidence, text messages, voicemails, and footage from our home security cameras. Every voicemail Evelyn had left me was filled with venom, accusing me of theft, manipulation, and worse. The camera footage showed her pounding on my door, yelling loud enough for the neighbors to hear. It was painful to relive those moments, but I knew it was necessary. When the restraining order was finally granted, I felt a sense of relief. Evelyn was legally prohibited from contacting me or my children, and if she violated the order, she would face serious consequences. But I knew this wasn't the end. Evelyn wasn't the type to back down easily. Sure enough, Evelyn found ways to push the boundaries of the restraining order. She started contacting people in my life, using them as intermediaries to try and reach me. She even tried to involve Mark's colleagues, claiming that she needed access to his professional records for closure. It was infuriating, but I refused to let her drag me into another confrontation. I kept documenting everything, preparing for the next step if she continued to escalate. Meanwhile, the rumors Evelyn had spread were starting to unravel. After months of silence, I finally responded to some of the messages I had received from Mark's family and friends. I calmly explained the situation, providing evidence of Evelyn's behavior and the steps Mark had taken to ensure his wishes were honored. Slowly, people began to see the truth. Some apologized for believing Evelyn's lies, while others simply stopped contacting me altogether. It was a small victory, but it gave me hope that I could rebuild my life piece by piece. One of the hardest parts of this ordeal was explaining everything to my children. They were too young to fully understand what was happening, but they could sense the tension in the air. My daughter, in particular, struggled with the idea that her grandmother didn't seem to love her the way other grandmothers loved their grandchildren. "Did we do something wrong?" she asked me one night, her voice small and hesitant. I hugged her tightly, fighting back tears. "No, sweetheart," I said. "You didn't do anything wrong. Your dad and I love you more than anything in the world, and that's what matters most." It was a conversation I never wanted to have, but it reminded me why I was fighting so hard to protect our family. Evelyn's actions weren't just hurting me. They were hurting my children too, and I wasn't going to let her win. As the weeks turned into months, I began to focus on moving forward. I leaned on my support system, friends, neighbors, and colleagues who stood by me through everything. I started therapy to help process my grief and the trauma of dealing with Evelyn's harassment. Slowly but surely, I began to find moments of peace. But I knew the fight wasn't over yet. Evelyn wasn't going to stop until she faced real consequences for her actions. And I was ready to make sure she did. After filing the restraining order, I thought I might finally have some peace. But Evelyn's venomous campaign against me continued to ripple through every aspect of my life. Even with the legal boundaries in place, her influence was hard to escape. She may have been physically kept at bay, but her lies had already spread far and wide, leaving me to pick up the pieces. Evelyn found ways to skirt the restraining order, leveraging anyone willing to listen to her twisted narrative. She convinced distant family members and old acquaintances to act as her proxies, delivering messages and accusations on her behalf. I would get unexpected phone calls or emails from people who believed her lies, each one filled with condescension, pity, or outright hostility. "She's grieving," they'd say. "Can't you just give her what she's asking for? It's the least you could do after everything she's been through." These words cut deep, not because they were true, but because they completely ignored my pain and my loss. Evelyn's grief was a weapon she wielded expertly, using it to paint herself as the victim while erasing the reality of what my children and I were going through. I was grieving too, grieving the loss of my husband, the father of my children, and the life we had built together. But none of that seemed to matter to the people she had convinced. What hurt the most was how her lies began to affect my children. My daughter, only 6 years old, came home from school one day with tears in her eyes. "Mommy," she whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit, "is it true that Grandma says you're bad?" I froze, my heart sinking like a stone. "Who told you that?" I asked gently, kneeling down to her level. "Anna said her mom heard Grandma talking about it," she said, her little voice trembling. "Why doesn't Grandma like us?" I held her tightly, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Sweetheart, your grandma is very sad right now, and sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're sad. But I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You are the most amazing little girl, and Daddy loved you so much. Nothing anyone says can ever change that." I spent the rest of the evening reassuring my children, but inside I was seething. Evelyn had gone too far. It was one thing to attack me, but dragging my children into her mess was unforgivable. That night, I decided I couldn't stay silent any longer. I sat down at my computer, pulling up every voicemail, text message, and email Evelyn had sent me over the past few months. I compiled a detailed timeline of her harassment, including the time she had shown up at my house unannounced and the lies she had spread to the community. I even included video footage from my home security cameras that captured her banging on my door and shouting obscenities. Armed with this mountain of evidence, I contacted my lawyer and told her I was ready to take legal action. "I want to sue her," I said firmly, "for harassment, defamation, emotional distress, everything." My lawyer agreed that we had a strong case. Together, we drafted a lawsuit that outlined all the ways Evelyn's actions had harmed me and my children. It wasn't just about the money, although the financial strain of dealing with her harassment was significant. It was about sending a clear message that her behavior was unacceptable and would not go unchecked. When Evelyn was served with the lawsuit, her reaction was swift and predictable. She sent me a scathing email, accusing me of trying to ruin her life and threatening to countersue. "You'll regret this," she wrote. "I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." But her threats didn't intimidate me. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of empowerment. I was no longer just reacting to her attacks, I was taking control of the situation. The legal process was grueling. Evelyn, true to her word, tried to fight back. She hired a lawyer and began spinning even more lies to discredit me. She claimed that I had manipulated Mark into writing her out of his will, that I had isolated him from his family, and that I was using his death as an excuse to enrich myself. Her accusations were baseless, but they were exhausting to deal with. I spent hours going over every detail of my relationship with Mark, providing evidence to refute her claims. I had copies of Mark's will, signed and notarized, as well as letters and emails he had written expressing his wishes. I also had testimony from friends and colleagues who had witnessed how much Mark loved and supported me. Piece by piece, we built an airtight case that exposed Evelyn's lies for what they were. As the case progressed, something unexpected happened. People who had initially sided with Evelyn began to see the truth. Mark's aunt, who had been one of Evelyn's staunchest supporters, reached out to me with an apology. "I'm so sorry," she said over the phone. "I didn't realize how much Evelyn was twisting things. I should have known better." Her words brought a lump to my throat. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That means a lot." One by one, others followed suit. Friends, neighbors, and even some of Evelyn's own family members began to distance themselves from her, realizing that her grief had turned into something toxic and destructive. It didn't erase the pain she had caused, but it felt like a small victory, a sign that the tide was finally turning. The lawsuit reached its climax when Evelyn was called to testify. Watching her on the stand was surreal. She tried to play the part of the grieving mother, her voice trembling as she spoke about losing her son. But under cross-examination, her facade began to crumble. My lawyer presented the evidence we had gathered, including her text messages, voicemails, and social media posts. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that Evelyn's actions weren't motivated by grief. They were driven by spite and a desperate need for control. When the verdict finally came, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The court ruled in my favor, granting damages for harassment and emotional distress. But more importantly, Evelyn was ordered to cease all contact with me and my children. Any violation of the court's orders would result in immediate legal consequences. After the ruling, Evelyn tried to reach out to me one last time. She sent me a long email, half apology and half justification. "I just wanted what was best for Mark," she wrote. "I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Evelyn had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. I was done letting her take up space in my life. In the months that followed, life slowly began to return to normal. I focused on rebuilding a sense of stability for my children, creating a home filled with love and laughter. It wasn't easy. There were still days when the grief felt overwhelming, when the absence of Mark was almost too much to bear. But we were healing one step at a time. Evelyn's influence faded into the background, a distant memory of a battle hard fought and won. For the first time since Mark's diagnosis, I felt like I could breathe again. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to move forward, carrying Mark's love and memory with me every step of the way. The court's ruling gave me the legal protection and peace of mind I desperately needed. Evelyn was no longer a looming threat in our lives, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could focus on the things that truly mattered: my children, my own healing, and honoring Mark's memory. But closure wasn't immediate. The damage Evelyn had caused lingered like a shadow, and moving forward was a process that required patience and strength. The first step in reclaiming my life was rebuilding my sense of community. Evelyn's lies had left their mark, but as the truth came to light, people who had distanced themselves from me started reaching out again. Mark's colleagues, neighbors, and even some of his extended family members apologized for believing Evelyn's narrative. They expressed their regret for not standing by me sooner and offered their support. While I appreciated their apologies, I was careful about letting people back into my life. I realized that I needed to set boundaries, not just with Evelyn but with everyone. My focus was on creating a safe and nurturing environment for my children, and I wasn't willing to let anyone disrupt that. One of the biggest challenges was helping my children process everything that had happened. They were too young to fully understand the extent of Evelyn's actions, but they had picked up on the tension and conflict. My daughter in particular struggled with feelings of confusion and sadness. She asked questions that were heartbreaking to answer. Why doesn't Grandma like us? Did we do something wrong? I made it my mission to reassure them every day that they were loved, cherished, and safe. I told them stories about Mark, how much he loved them, how proud he was of them, and all the wonderful memories we had shared as a family. We created a small memory corner in the house with photos of Mark and mementos from our time together. It became a space where we could honor his memory and celebrate his life, rather than dwell on the pain of his absence. I also enrolled them in therapy to help them navigate their grief and emotions. Their therapist was a kind and compassionate woman who created a safe space for them to express their feelings. Over time, I saw them begin to heal. Their laughter returned, their curiosity blossomed, and they started to feel like kids again. It was a relief to see them finding joy despite everything we had been through. For my part, I leaned heavily on therapy as well. I needed to process the grief, anger, and betrayal that had defined the past year of my life. My therapist helped me unpack not just the loss of Mark, but also the complex relationship with Evelyn and the impact it had on my mental health. She reminded me that it was okay to feel conflicted, that I could grieve for the relationship I wished I had with Evelyn while still recognizing that cutting her out of my life was the right decision. One of the most significant breakthroughs came during a session where we talked about guilt. I had been carrying a heavy burden, feeling as though I had somehow failed Mark by not being able to mend the rift between him and his mother. But my therapist helped me see that it wasn't my responsibility to fix their relationship. Evelyn's choices were her own, and I had done everything I could to support Mark while honoring his wishes. Letting go of that guilt was liberating, and it allowed me to focus on the present rather than dwelling on the past. As the months went by, life began to take on a new rhythm. I returned to work part-time, immersing myself in projects that reignited my passion and gave me a sense of purpose. My colleagues were incredibly supportive, understanding that I needed flexibility as I navigated this new chapter of my life. Work became a welcome distraction, a way to channel my energy into something productive. Outside of work, I started reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. I joined a local support group for widows and widowers, where I found a sense of camaraderie and understanding that I hadn't realized I needed. Sharing my story and hearing others' experiences reminded me that I wasn't alone, and it gave me hope that brighter days were ahead. One day, while going through some of Mark's belongings, I found a letter he had written to me shortly before his death. It was tucked away in a drawer, hidden among old photographs and keepsakes. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and began to read. In the letter, Mark spoke about his love for me and our children. He thanked me for standing by him through everything and expressed his gratitude for the life we had built together. He also wrote about his mother, acknowledging the pain her actions had caused, but urging me not to let her bitterness overshadow the love we had shared as a family. "Don't let her steal your joy," he wrote. "Our life was beautiful because of you, and I want you to hold on to that. You're stronger than you realize, and I know you'll continue to build a life filled with love, kindness, and happiness. For you and the kids, I'll always be with you." Tears streamed down my face as I read his words. In that moment, I felt a sense of clarity and peace that I hadn't felt in months. Mark's love and faith in me were a guiding light, reminding me of what truly mattered. With time, I began to see glimpses of hope and happiness. My children and I started creating new traditions: Saturday morning pancake breakfasts, family movie nights, and weekend hikes. We found joy in the little moments, and slowly but surely, our home began to feel like a place of healing rather than a reminder of loss. Evelyn's presence faded into the background. The legal settlement ensured that she couldn't contact us or disrupt our lives, and I made a conscious decision not to let her bitterness consume me. Instead, I focused on the future, on raising my children with the love and support they deserved, on honoring Mark's memory, and on building a life that he would be proud of. Looking back, I'm struck by how far we've come. The road has been anything but easy, but it has taught me the importance of resilience, boundaries, and the power of love. Mark may be gone, but his legacy lives on in our children and in the life we're creating together. And while I can't control the actions of others, I can choose how I respond. For the sake of my family, I choose peace, love, and hope.